How do we represent ourselves online? For example, the way we use our Facebook page, which is perhaps predominantly made up of friends and family, is different than how we interact on our LinkedIn profile, which may be used for our professional lives. It's useful to think about who we are and how we represent ourselves in our social media platforms. When are we using our professional persona, our weekend hobby persona, our dating app persona? In each of these examples, there are certain personality characteristics that are presented with more emphasis than others. We might also think of our online selves as a disembodied communication process, where the academic John Durham Peters outlines the process of communication exists beyond speech itself. If we think of how we communicate across the telephone or in an email even, we often lose the humanistic nuances such as tone, facial expression, voice, or thought. We now rely on media to translate or embody our communication. In this sense, our communication has become disembodied. When using social media, we are disembodied from our communication practice, so we rely on the construction of symbols and texts to represent who we are in the online space. This may be demonstrated in the way we talk and the language we use. We are likely to use a more formal style of English and talk in a matter-of-fact tone in our professional space, whereas we usually use very relaxed language in our personal networks and rely, for example, on humour to convey messages. Linking to other pages and resources on the internet is also a powerful way of demonstrating our online personality. In the professional sense, we are likely to post links that refer to current research or perhaps a political event. In personal spaces, we might post a link to a funny story or a general interesting article, a YouTube clip of something amazing, or perhaps even an activist site that our friends may be interested in. Our online selves are also represented through the sorts of images we post. Again, using the professional and personal dichotomy, my professional self might post a graph or a statistic, whereas my personal space is likely to contain photos of my children or holidays, for example. In each of these examples, there is a clear division between two aspects of our lives. But what happens when those personas collide? There have been cases where individuals have been fired from professional positions for comments on social media. Consider this empirical example that erupted in Australia during 2015, when a special broadcasting service journalist, Scott McIntyre, was fired for his social media use during his day off. McIntyre, a sports reporter and presenter, referred to some Australians during a national public holiday as poorly read, largely white, nationalist drinkers and gamblers on his Twitter account. He wrote these comments on Anzac Day, which is a day of remembrance for returned Australian and New Zealand servicemen and women. These comments were deemed by the broadcaster to be inappropriate and disrespectful. This case is particularly interesting as McIntyre built his Twitter persona around his identity as a professional sports reporter. Had he posted those comments from another Twitter profile, one would argue to the extent of which his employer would have been involved, or if the comments would have been surfaced in the public at all. The tension here is that McIntyre used his Twitter handle to communicate as a particular professional individual, and when the message suddenly shifted to air his personal views, his audience reacted in an unprecedented way, including the then Australian Minister for Communication calling for his resignation. The McIntyre case clearly demonstrates how mixing our online personas can have dire repercussions. Judith Butler is one of the leading scholars on gender and identity, and her teachings can be drawn on to think through some of the implications of representation in the online environment. She notes that we embrace our identity through our sexuality because we own a certain gender and we understand that gender, for example, what it is meant to be, how it operates, etc. If this is the case, we use aspects of our identity to convey certain messages through the disembodiment of communication beyond human speech. We construct our identity through an assemblage of symbols, including our language, tone, images, avatars, taglines, and shared content. Just as Butler notes, we do this through our sexuality. We also operate in this fashion on social media. We are a collection or an assemblage of communication texts and symbols, which are demonstrated through what we say, what we post, and what we share. One final important area to consider when thinking about social media and self-representation is the concept of the individual and their communication power. This explains the question, why do some campaigns gain traction on social media while others don't take off? Individuality can be a form of power, where some users are more influential than others because of their authority they command when using social media platforms. The philosopher Michel Foucault highlights individual power as something attached to one's individuality. We see this play out in everyday social media in how some users rely on their own authority to sway conversations and indeed influence how discussions emerge. If an influential user starts a communication thread on social media in a particular tone or approach, it is very difficult for other users to sway the majority of users' thought processes or sway opinion. In a social structure, Barry Wellman notes networked individualism represents how personal community networks give rise to the individual as the primary unit of connectivity. This provides the basis for the power of those individuals who hold the most influence. In thinking about how online communities form and the lead users emerge from within, a user demonstrating high knowledge levels can ultimately strengthen the value of its members' connections. Therefore, an individual will also use knowledge as a means of constructing their online representation in a social media environment. The knowledge that one individual can bring to a group is directly related to the power they may develop. It is the lead users that are able to construct significant power relations and mobilize specific social media movements. Christian Fuchs provides us with a great empirical example of communication power through identity, which is constructed identity through one's knowledge. By collectively engaging in the faceless identity which is portrayed through the Guy Fawkes mask, members of Anonymous are engaging in mass self-communication to collectively push an ideal amongst a broader group of individuals with the common purpose of keeping the internet free and open. Ironically, despite the name, Anonymous are one of the social media groups who best demonstrate strong identity and online representation. To sum up our discussion, there are 4 key areas that highlight how we represent ourselves in the social media environment. First is the language we choose to use. This determines in which circles we are communicating and how we align ourselves with particular pre-existing discourses. Second is the imagery we choose to attach to our online media selves. Given the rise of visual communication in the networked communication environment, the use of imagery is significant in demonstrating who we are in social media. Third, the forms of links, diagrams, and imagery that we share constructs the very image of who we are. And finally, the specific and niche knowledge that we bring with us is crucial for constructing an online identity. This is especially important when mobilizing groups, or what we might consider online communities to be, to start campaigns and build momentum behind specific issues of interest.